Okay, as part of our virtual class today, I wanted to create a little video about Alexander Nevsky. This is a 1938 film released in December 1938, directed by Sergei Eisenstein. It's produced in the Soviet Union during the time when Joseph Stalin, of course, was the Russian premier, and you can see kind of the fingerprints of Soviet Russia all over this, right? There was Eisenstein, who had already made a name for himself as a filmmaker and would go on to make other films, including a kind of biopic of Ivan the Terrible. Was a really groundbreaking filmmaker. But given the kind of government oversight that existed under Joseph Stalin, there was a good deal of that happened with Eisenstein. In writing the script, he had to work together with essentially people appointed by the government to make sure that he wasn't doing anything subversive. The production, had a lot of government oversight with it. And so, this can be read, I think, very much as a propaganda film, or at least one that is in keeping with the values of, communism in the Soviet Union in the late 1930s, even perhaps blunting some of the criticism of the Soviets for their, policies of collective farms and, the kinds of things that led to famines and we might even say genocide in the Ukraine and other parts of the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s, right? There was a lot of international kind of backlash against some of these policies, and Alexander Nevsky is a way of celebrating the values of the Russian people and specifically Soviet values, right? And so I think that this film says more about the context of the 1930s than it does about its actual subject matter. The subject matter is a battle fought between the Russians who were defending the city of Novgorod, led by a prince named Alexander. This is Alexander Nevsky, the titular character, right? And this took place in 1242. This was part of the Northern Crusades, which was a kind of sequence of events where the Catholic countries of Western Europe, specifically through the vehicle of the Teutonic Order, the Teutonic Knights, who tend to be associated with Germany, but they were not solely German knights, right? Here they are solely German. It's the Germans who become the oppressors, but the Teutonic Order took over large parts of Eastern Europe, all with the goal of spreading Catholic Christianity and prosecuting and persecuting people who were still pagan or people who were practicing the Orthodox faith, which was the majority of people, and that was deemed problematic and if not heretical by Catholicism, right? So this was a famous battle. It's a kind of signal moment in the history of Russia. It's one that has been viewed by Russians as a time of great triumph, where the Knights of the Teutonic Order were turned back in their attempt to take Novgorod. One of the most famous aspects of this film is the score by the famous classical composer Sergei Prokofiev. And the score plays a vital role in the film itself, right? In fact, it may be the most important element in certain scenes, particularly the opening stages of the famous battle on the ice, which is kind of the culminating sequence of the film. And so, as you watch this, as you think about it, pay attention to the role that music plays in this. We can see these the influence, as I said earlier, of the Stalin era context, lots of communist sentiments, and then moreover, this was a period where the relations between the Soviet Union and Germany, Nazi Germany, were strained. They did make a treaty a few months after this, right? In August of 1939, immediately preceding the German invasion, and this. If you remember, I think that the Soviets simultaneously invaded eastern Poland while the Germans invaded western Poland. This is all part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop treaty. But, in this film, there are Russian boyars. These are kind of nobles, big landholders who are advocating for making peace with the Germans. And so it's kind of interesting thing here that the sentiment is almost entirely anti-German, but then the Stalin government decided to do a few months after this was made, after this was released, decided to do exactly the thing that's being criticized in this film. And one wonders if it had been released a few months later, if that would have been allowed to pass, if the film would have been released in general, right, given the amount of oversight that existed under Stalin's Soviet Union. Let's look at a few, kind of still shots of the film representing the communist values, right? So in a key opening scene, when we first get introduced to the city of Novgorod, we have these boyars, right, who have said, we have signed a treaty with the Germans. And, what we're really interested in is trade, and the Germans are important trading partners, and so we've signed a treaty with them. And the one who responds to this is this character right here, whose name is Vasilisa. And so there's another city neighboring Novgorod, which is called Pskov, and that city has been taken by the Teutonic Knights, right? And there's scenes of destruction in that city. And Vasilisa's father is executed by the Germans. He's hoisted up and kind of hanged from the city battlements. And so Vasilisa flees to Novgorod, and immediately when these boyars in Novgorod say that we've signed a treaty, she says, you're selling out, or something akin to, you're selling out the Russian land, right, for your own greed. This is very much a criticism of capitalism and a kind of celebration of communist values. Contrast that with figures like the blacksmith, and I can't remember his exact name, but he's an important character in the film, right? He's a businessman and a craftsman, but when it becomes clear that the army being recruited to defend Novgorod needs weapons and armor, he simply says, "Take everything I've got, take it all. It's all for the good of the people," right? And so he becomes a kind of communist hero. 13th century communist hero somehow, right? And then he later fights himself. He's left with his last piece of chainmail, and it's too small for him, and that ends up as his undoing because he's killed at the end because the chainmail doesn't entirely protect him, but he, is a hero nevertheless. Anti-German sentiment in the film, there's a lot of this, right? One of the most noticeable things is this character of the Catholic bishop. And if you look closely at his mitre here, you can see something akin to the swastika, right? This is not something that would have happened in a medieval Catholic bishop's garb, vestments. But that's put there very subtly. And in fact, in early kind of production, they had swastikas on the German knights' helmets and shields and things like this, and I guess they decided that wasn't historically accurate, but there is a sort of subtle nod to Nazism here. The German knights themselves are viewed almost as like mechanized warriors. These are like tanks, right? And particularly in the battle on the ice when they're riding across on their horses, and each of the kind of key knights, the commanders, have these special helmets. This one has like a bird's talon on it. I'm not sure what's going on here. One of them has a hand. One of them, has a bird head on it. These are kind of interesting things. But they're, they are reminiscent of the mechanized blitzkrieg type army that the Nazis were assembling in the 1930s, right? Another key scene is where the clergy are presiding over the execution of, innocent women and children. You've got these clergymen throwing children into the fire, and these close-ups on children who were screaming. I've often wondered, what went into that production. What did they tell the kids? Like, let us throw you down here, and then we'll give you a piece of candy or something like that. I don't know. But it's a rather grisly scene here to really vilify and even demonize the Germans. And then, contrast that with the celebration of Russia. And nowhere is this more stark than at the very end of the film, when in celebration, Alexander Nevsky's giving his speech, announcing the victory of the defense of Novgorod. And, he gives a kind of warning here. And this may be a shot across the bow of Nazi Germany in a way, right? Whosoever shall come to us with a sword. Well, he says, just before this, he says, Russia is open to everyone. Please come. Ours is a peaceful land, right? But then he says, but whoever shall come to us with a sword shall perish with the sword. And so, this seems to be an anticipation of a looming war between Germany and the Soviet Union, and the memory of the First World War, where those two sides fought against each other, was still very fresh in people's minds, having happened only 20 years before this. As I said, the most famous scene in the film is the battle on the ice. This is a kind of reenactment of the battle at Lake Chudskoye in the year, I think this is March 1242, right? And so just some key scenes from this, right? Notice the contrast between the tank-like German knights, these mechanized warriors with their metal frames, and then the very simple kind of peasant soldiers. Actually, that'd be down here. Actually, they got these helmets. These were kind of retooled helmets from the First World War Russian army. And so they're not really authentic, I think, to the 13th century, right? But you get this simple garb. They're wearing chainmail. They are outmatched in many ways, but the kind of the power of the people is what wins out ultimately, right? And then you have these very kind of stoic characters. The subplot where you have Gavrilo and Vasily competing for the hand of the woman named Olga, and they become the kind of key generals in this is Alexander Nevsky himself, but they're the key generals, and so Gavrilo leads one of the flanking charges while Vasily defends the middle, and Alexander takes the right flank. So here you have the three of them all lined up, looking rather intrepid. The filming of this, this took a cast of hundreds, if not thousands, of people, right? This is very much in the kind of epic war film tradition and broke ground in that way, right? If you consider more recent films that try to show this sort of thing, like, I don't know, Saving Private Ryan or even Lord of the Rings or something like that, right? They owe a debt to the ground broken by Sergei Eisenstein and his recreation of the battle on the ice. So pay close attention to that film. Look at the way that the Prokofiev score works in the battle on the ice sequence, right? You have this kind of brooding music, and then you have this rather maniacal music as the Germans are riding across, and then you have, of course, this heroic music, right? The music changes with the depiction of the different armies, and that was another truly groundbreaking thing, right? The shifting music to set the mood, to try to send messages about the characters and what they represented and all of that. So those are some important elements, I think, of the film itself. There's a lot more we could say about this, and I do want to have a brief discussion, at least in class, on that. But hopefully that gets you going on this, and hopefully you appreciated this film for what it is. All right, thanks.